Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix. It's easy for me to have paranoia, and I think it's easy in general to have a paranoid worldview. There's something about the way in which my mind functions to where it's easy for me to see most things as being threatening, even neutral or arbitrary things as being threatening, to the point to where I think that people have negative intentions, sometimes even malevolent intentions, to the point to where even the universe itself in some kind of distorted, horrific, terrifying panpsychism has some kind of negative intention. And I definitely get pulled into that view to where everything is malevolent and everything is bent on destroying you, as in this conspiracy of the universe, where you're the butt of the joke and where you get the brunt of the destruction. And it's super interesting because I know in my mind that that is to some degree just part of the way that my wiring is, to the point to where I am too paranoid, and that's not always helpful, if helpful at all. It might be useful for managing situations and maybe being more realistic in kind of a depressive realism sense, to the point to where you recognize that, yeah, you can't trust everybody, and you probably should have some degree of suspicion. And yet, of course, when you take this idea too far, it becomes really problematic, because then there's no one to trust, and there's no one that you can talk to, there's no one that you can relate to, and everything becomes this vicious malevolence that you're just expecting. And so in my mind, the reason why I think this is important to confront is because I do have my significant paranoia, but it goes deep into questions about what is actually real, which is actually one of the fundamental questions that drives me to the question of trying to figure out what actually is real, because I've spent so much of my life struggling to trust even my own mind or my own senses or my own thoughts or my own experiences and beliefs and ideas, to the point to where I don't believe anything is real, to the point to where it's easy for me to assume that I can't trust myself in this hyper-skepticism. And this goes right to the heart of what I've been thinking about lately, which could start with Cartesian skepticism, for instance, and the whole notion of thinking that you can't even trust what you see, or that you can't trust what's around you, that you can't trust the external world. And at least since the time of Plato, we have doubted appearances, because the point is to try to get closer to the truth. The point is to try to see what's really there. The point is to look behind the veil. And this is what drives me. This is what I would say I'm actually obsessed with. And I totally understand the problem with taking the hyper-skeptical approach to assume that nothing is real. And I understand that there are a lot of problems with that, just from a practical sense of, like, how do you function in the world? And I don't even mean to do it, because I don't want to make it so black and white and say that I doubt the external world. But I have had trouble understanding my mind and understanding my thoughts, and that's deeply rooted in paranoia, to the point to where you ask yourself, is anything real? Can you trust anything? And like I said, that's been my obsession for a lot of reasons. And I haven't figured out what to do with that, except to continue to drive forward, to try to understand it, and to understand how I actually look at things. And so it's easy to look at it from the perspective of simulation theory, where you might look at it as, how do we know that we're not living in a simulation? How do we know that we're not being fooled by an evil demon? How do we know that we're not being tricked as a brain in a vat into thinking that nothing is actually real? And I think it's an interesting question for a lot of reasons, mostly because I don't think that there's any real answer, or at least any immediate answer that can make sense, at least to me and to kind of my skepticism and my approach, to the point to where I do doubt even the most basic assumption that there is an external world, because of my paranoia. And because of the fact that I don't think that I can trust anything that I experience. And that if we can't even prove any of these scenarios, the fact that we're not in a simulation, it makes things incredibly complicated, because it makes it seem as though we'll never be able to figure it out. We'll never be able to figure out what's actually real. And I know that that's a tough question. And I know that you can only go so far with it. I know that you can only go so far with that understanding, because you have to live in the practical world we find ourselves. But if we can't even prove on the most basic level what is actually real and what actually influences us to think the way that we do, and what our experiences are actually made of, it becomes incredibly complicated, because then you can't figure it out. And like I said, that's where the paranoia comes in. What if it actually is a conspiracy and everything is bent on destroying any perspective that you may have, of destroying any truth that you may have? And it isn't as though this is just the mind trying to understand itself. It's also the fact that the world does seem to be very much resistant to individuals, to the point to where we can't even ask questions because we're constantly being challenged, to the point to where we can't ask questions because otherwise we're going to be destroyed. And I always thought that was interesting, to think about that, like, we actually are prevented from asking questions. We're prevented from seeking and searching. And again, I go back to the idea, how could that be the paranoid worldview? The fact that you can't trust anything, the fact that you can't trust your senses or your thoughts, the fact that you can't trust what you're experiencing and what you're seeing and what your senses are showing you. And that is a terrifying place to be. But skepticism, even just basic thought, can lead us to that understanding and that premise, to the point to where we find ourselves to be completely screwed, because maybe we'll never know. There's no reason to assume that we would even ever know, that we'd ever have any idea. That's part of what makes it so tough for me, is because even though I would have to say from a common sense view, I can build on knowledge, and I can build on some of the things that I believe have to be true, there's an extent to which my mind doesn't do that at all, to the point to where most of what I'm doing is actually built from the paranoia of thinking that it is a conspiracy, and that the things that I would like to be able to understand are actually not so easily understood, to the point to where there's no clarity, to the point to where I'm stuck because I can't prove it. And I have to acknowledge that, yes, that's the terrifying place of mental illness. But is it really so far removed from what human experience and the human condition might actually reveal to us? Is the universe so tangible? Even just the fact of mathematics as being this abstract thing that still somehow correlates to the world enough, but that still seems to be its own separate thing. And that's part of the difficulty with all of this, is that there is no certainty and there's no way to understand anything that's real. And so in that way, it becomes incredibly complicated trying to understand, and it becomes incredibly difficult and leads to a lot of problems with the fact that you can't actually prove it. As much as you wish that you could, as much as you wish that you could prove that something is real and that something is tangible, having an inability to do so because of all of the problems that exist, because of the way that the world is, because of the human condition, because of the way that the mind works, and how much that definitely sucks, but how that definitely is something that you can't escape. And I've at least found in my experience that that's something that I can't escape. And that's partly where all of the paranoia comes from. It's partly where my confusion comes from. It's partly where the fear comes from. And so the terror isn't going to go anywhere, because I recognize that I may never know. I may never be able to figure it out. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I hope that you'll check out my other videos. I hope that you'll check out my books. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.